of how Ferdinand Magellan was the Portuguese navigator sailing for Spain, and he left Spain in August 1519, and he arrived Samar. He reached Samar in March 16, 1521. He reached Cebu April 7, 1521, and not too long after, he got himself killed in Mactan, April 27, 1521. But there was still one ship among the 5 that he had that made it back to Spain. So Antonio Pigafetta recorded this. It was their he was their chronicler, and so this was the written history. In fact, Magellan's journey and reaching Cebu was most significant historically. It was tantamount to our reaching the moon, or now we are sending things to Mars. So this was very important in that sense, in that scientific sense. But what we need to realize as writers and readers is that this quintessential quincentennial celebration is an opportunity for us to understand some things. 1521 marked the beginning of Spanish colonization of the Philippines. The Spaniards destroyed most of our documented history and our stories. Our culture shifted to accommodate the domination of Western influence. The Eurocentric point of view became dominant, and our matriarchal society that had always been in the Philippines became patriarchal. Our culture, even now, values Western concept of beauty, perhaps fair is beautiful. And because of our Western books and movies, we try to emulate a lifestyle that is not ours, or this lifestyle that we see on the screen or that we read about, in a way seems more real than our own real lives. So it is important for us to realize that this is going on in our minds, in our mindset. And what it is that we as readers, as writers, as Filipinos, should strive for our own Filipino point of view. This is very important because it has a lot to do with our sense of identity, our sense of nationhood. Because much has been lost or buried by the dominant culture, historians, anthropologists, folklorists are searching or reconstructing what had been. In a sense, we as readers and writers also have to search what is ours. We also have to search what is authentic. We have to develop our own point of view. So this year, 2021, is a good time to reflect on all of this. We can appreciate the significance and importance of circumnavigating the world, of Magellan's journey reaching the Philippines. We can be interested in all work to discover it again, to rediscover it, or perhaps reimagine. I think that we can look at some slides, and I want to talk to you a little bit about my childhood in Cebu. So here I am. I'm actually the baby. This is the only baby picture that I have. I am with my oldest sister, another sister, and my brother. My father was an engineer, and here he is, and there I am next to him with the bangs. I'm the one with the bangs. And we lived in the capital area. My mother was a businesswoman. My father was an engineer. And I went to St. Teresa's College in Cebu. And later, for high school, I went to St. Teresa's College in Manila, in San Marcelino. We'll show another slide. This is my mother and me. I think I was around 14 at this time. My mother was widowed because my father died when I was 9. And if you read some of my stories, you will come across my mother and you will come across my father, although they have been fictionalized because that is what writers do. And here is my sister, my brother, and me with the doll in our house in Cebu. So my roots are really in Cebu. But let me tell you how I became a writer. First, I wanted to it's actually a long journey to become a writer because at some point I wanted to be an engineer. Well, I didn't fully understand that to be an engineer, you have to be really good in math, which was not my strength. And so I went on to communication arts at Maryknoll. And I thought while I was there that I would like to be a filmmaker. And it was because I wanted to be a filmmaker that I ended up in California, actually. I attended UCLA film school, but then got sidetracked because I got married and also realized that filmmaking is very collaborative and that as a person, I prefer working on my own. And so it was when the children were small, the second one actually was, or the youngest, uh, uh, when I had time at home as a housewife, I started writing nonfiction, and then I started playing and writing short stories, which were really not good. But they got better when I started to take creative writing classes at UCLA. And bit by bit, I started to get published. But in the very beginning, I had difficulty with my writing voice. And I'm sharing this with you because perhaps some of you who are writers may experience it. I think what happened was that the books that I was reading were mostly Western. I grew up in a staple of Nancy Drew when I was a little girl, Emily Loring, it went on and then it graduated to Faulkner and Hemingway. And so it was just Western literature into my head. Honestly, it was mostly what was in my head. And when I started writing, well, it was really, when I think about it, it was no surprise that I was sort of starting to sound like Hemingway or Faulkner instead of Cecilia Brainard. And I had to have some very kind of severe feedback, perhaps you would call it, critiquing from fellow writers to realize that something was amiss with my writing. I could put a story together, I could create character, but it was askew. This was what one woman, my workshopper companion, told me. Anyone from New York could have written this story. And that just sat in my head. It hurt me a lot, but it sat in my head because I was not from New York. I was from Cebu. So what was the problem? Why were my stories coming out like some New Yorker wrote it? Something was wrong. And so I made a concerted effort to study to understand what writing voice is about. And I read Dostoevsky, and I read A.M. Forster, and I read various other good writers to understand why their voice was unique. And bit by bit, I also started to experiment and made a concerted effort to look at Cebu, which is my material, if you will, and started to write about Cebu and the characters that I knew, that I grew up with, that I had come across. There was something that happened when I started to do that. I would get blocked because, I was going to hurt people's feelings and they really were not like that. And I felt compelled to be absolutely correct and truthful in everything I wrote. Then one day I was just sort of doodling and I reversed the letters of Cebu, U-B-E-C. I sort of liked how it looked and how it sounded, Ubec. And I used it in my writing, in my setting. And it was just like magic. Suddenly, I felt free. I could lie. I could change things around. I did not feel compelled to tell exactly what happened. I did not feel compelled to describe and to be, perfectly true in this character or in that place and so on. I was free. I was liberated. I could write fiction using Ubec. And so that was really pretty much what it was. I could um, I could fictionalize people, characters more easily. It allowed me to rearrange geography as needed in my story. It even allowed me to tweak history to some degree. And I mention this because actually many of my stories are they're not exactly historical fiction, but I do use our history. And then sometimes I tweak them. But they're the history is sound. And so, for instance, my World War II novel, When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, is what occurs during the war is consistent with historical events. There's only one incident in there where I applied poetic license, and it was an airplane crash, and I made it up and tweaked it, and I just say poetic license. Oh, the other thing was that when I was trying to write the truth accurately, now and then historians or very left-brain people would come to me and say, "Wait, that street is wrong," or historically, they start picking on details, which then finally I was free of once I created fictional Ubec. So how does being in California shape my vision of Cebu? Actually, the question is, how does being a writer overseas influence or shape your vision of Cebu? So first of all, actually, I visit the Philippines except for the pandemic. I visit it regularly. So I'm not out of touch, I'm usually there twice a year. So I know what's going on. But at the same time, the things in my head are things, a lot of them are memories. A lot of them are personal histories. And things have changed along the way. So in some sense, the Cebu that I knew is just only it's not really the Cebu now. I'm sorry, there's a hand that's raised. Is there any problem with the sound or anything like that? If there is, if you could let me know, I'd appreciate it. You can just type the chat. So being far away has forced me to dig deep, to search my memories, to look at the people who interested me, to look at what I call my Filipino experience. My other writings also look at what I call my Filipino American experience. But in this particular case, we're talking about my Filipino experience. Being in California forced me to focus not so much on the language. I will talk about language in a little while, adding Filipino words or not, for instance, when you're writing, but on character and how to create complex characters. Because of all the elements of storytelling, in the end, it's character that is most important. And complex characters are what writers should strive for. The business of language is a little bit tricky because I am writing in English about Cebu or Ubec. or Manila or Mexico or wherever my setting is. And I've had to think about this. I've had to make choices. Number one, when I'm workshopping my drafts here in California, my readers are generally Americans. And so I've had to take that into consideration. If I put too many Cebuano words or Tagalog words, they're just going to be confused. I cannot write in Cebuano and present it to an American group because they just wouldn't know what was going on. So how this has influenced me then is to keep my language simple, keep my writing simple and straightforward, not too flowery, not and just get to the point of it. Just be succinct. And again, as I mentioned, to focus on character. Of course, the character is in conflict. Of course, there is plot and all these other things. But I'm not generally very big on flowery words. I will have some what you call local color, some words in there. But again, I don't make a big thing about it. I like to tell a story of one of my friends in Manila who I'm not sure, she wanted to be a writer. And we would talk about it sometimes, and she would agonize over whether her writing should include the word tinapa or not. I mean, there was just so much energy about the tinapa. And I told her, I said, well, how about just using salted fish? I mean, in the whole scheme of things, your story, it's not going to make or break your story if you use salted fish. And I don't know if she listened to me, but honestly, whether if you use tinapa, sure, I mean, the Filipinos will get it. But what if your readership is more international? They wouldn't have the sight, In other words, you weigh your words that you're going to put in there. Is it really that important for me to put tinapa in or not? Or do you just want the readers to focus on the real meat of the story? So this is some of those things that you think about and that you choose. So you can see that my writing my writing does not so much try to recreate Cebu, because as I said, my memories are Cebu that's no longer there, or I've already tweaked Cebu into Ubec. But I have reimagined it in my head. And it is very real to me. The geography is real. The characters, even though they're loosely based on somebody I knew, classmates, my mother, whoever it may be, are very real as characters to me. I believe that they are complex characters. So let me see. I just want to make sure that we have covered this question about where Ubec came from. Actually, this is what I'm trying to get across here. Where did Ubec come from? Oh, by the way, I was very interested. I was in Cebu once, and I was on the way to the airport, and I glanced out the window, and right on the wall was a huge graffiti of a rainbow, and it looked really happy, and all across it was Ubec. And it just made me smile, that would just end up right there. But somehow that was significant to somebody. I reimagined Cebu, so to speak. And we can look at some pictures, some slides. So these would be, I'm showing you some writers who have influenced me. So this is Lina Espina Moore, who is one of her Cebuana writers. And the reason I'm sharing this photo with you is that Lina was she mentored me. When I was a beginning writer, there Lina was. She was already an accomplished writer with a number of novels. And she and I would talk, and she would sort of give me advice. And she was most generous with her time and information and connections too. She's really a very generous woman. She used to tell me, Dai, write like you talk. And I understood her, even though you don't really write like you talk. But I understood that what she was saying was, don't have pretensions when you write. Just write normally. So this is Lina Espinamore, and you should look her up. And also Estrella Alfon is another one of our Cebuana writers, and they are both really good writers. And here we have NBM Gonzalez, and we could go back to NBM. So NBM Gonzalez is also another fine Filipino writer, and I knew him in the United States, in California. And he also used to sort of encourage me or mentor me to some extent. But it was Ben Santos, the next picture, Bienvenido N. Santos, who was most generous in terms of helping me. In fact, it was, if you could get the next slide, it was Ben Santos who actually introduced me to my first publisher. That would be Mrs. Gloria Rodriguez at New Day. And that it was Gloria Rodriguez who published my first books. And so we are not seeing Ben Santos, and he may have disappeared, but it's fine. We'll move on. It's all right. So we'll look at the pictures, the covers for now. So I arranged this so that we can just kind of look at the books that I have worked on. And so the top three are my novels, When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, set in Ubec, Magdalena, also set in Ubec, and The Newspaper Widow, set in Ubec. They're of different topics, and the first one, When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, is a World War II novel. Magdalena is a story of three generations of women who have had to deal with historic events, how they have reacted to historic events in the Philippines. And The Newspaper Widow, and I will talk about it a little bit more later, because if we have time, I would like to read from this book an excerpt for you. And then we have my short story collections, Woman with Horns and Other Stories. This is the US edition. Acapulco Sunset and Other Stories, also the US edition. The Philippine editions are pretty much out of print. And Vegan and Other Stories. And then we have selected short stories, which will be released by the University of Santo Tomas Press around August. And selected short stories gathers 39 of what I think are the best of my stories. So that should be a good collection. And then we have some nonfiction, Cecilia's Diary, which was my diary, excerpts from my diary. And Fundamentals of Creative Writing is nonfiction. And I believe most of you know that this is available. I have made this available for free in Wattpad, so you can look it up. And I did this when the pandemic started. In my imagination, it is to help teachers and students who have pretty much had to work from their homes. And I thought, well, something online would help them. Fundamentals of Creative Writing, Cecilia Brainard in Wattpad. Some more nonfiction, Out of Cebu, and Magical Years, Memories and Sketches. I started sketching about 2 years ago. I was never an artist, but for some reason this came out. And so I tried, I did sketches of Cebu, or in my, they're my interpretation. And so it was, little images of, with my father, maybe of Alan Mar's bookstore, because that's where he used to take us to buy books and so on. So there are many other books. So the nonfiction, I think that Dr. Magan had run through them, and so these are the covers of this book. Some of them have Philippine edition or U.S. edition, so they may look different, but they're the same. And so this leads us to the question of the pandemic and writers. And Dr. Lee Sen had sent me these questions. What does it take for a writer to write, I suppose, in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic? And who is Cecilia Manguerra Brainard in the post-pandemic era? You know, we are in a historic time, really. Oops, here we go. Here is Ben Santos, Bienvenido N. Santos. And he's one of our finest writers. And I'm sure you all know about his work, but he not only was a fine writer, but he was a very, very kind person. And so he was the one who told me, Cecilia, send your work to Gloria Rodriguez. He used to write me letters during, it was pre email. And so fine writer, fine human being, and I'm grateful to him for all his help. So the questions from Dr. Listen. What does it take for a writer in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic? And who is Cecilia Manguerra Brainard in the post-pandemic era? COVID, of course, we are all in it, and it is always, it's number one in our minds right now. It's a very difficult time for everyone, and it's difficult for writers and readers alike. I will just talk to you about what I have done to survive it and what I have heard other writers do to be able to survive it and keep saying, really. First, I have to tell you a little story. You know, when this COVID broke out, I was in Cebu, and I was in Cebu in late January 2020. And when I got there, Taal had exploded. And so I had with me some face masks for the ash. And then while I was there, in less than a week or so, there was this news that this man from China suddenly died. And, you know, people were still sort of acting normal, you know, whatever it was. But meantime, in China, we're already getting the news that things were really bad and so on in Wuhan. But the next day after this Chinese gentleman died, his woman companion died. And by this time, things sort of like went crazy. Suddenly you couldn't buy face masks. I was in Cebu. And suddenly I thought, oh my goodness, I really should make sure that I get on my airplane because I might get stuck because they were already starting to block the flights. So it was kind of an exciting, in a way, it was exciting and harrowing because some flights were canceled and I had to like be at the airport, you know, really, really early. To truncate the story, I made it back. And the irony, in a sense, was when we arrived in LAX in California, most of us got rid of our face masks because we felt we were safe. And of course, nobody was safe because it got here and it was also very bad here. And so to everyone, we just have to be really, really careful right now. So what has been going on? So some of the writers I know, it's very interesting. They have started gardening, they have started baking. There was a lot of baking going on. Of course, Netflix and movies, home movies were very, very popular, and reading was very, very popular. There was a time of exploring other facets that you like because you were stuck at home. What did I do? So you know, there's quite a lot of energy to protect your body. I have to tell you that it was constantly in my mind, and I had Purell all over the place, and I used to have I wouldn't bring groceries in. They were outside and I would sterilize everything before it came in. But in any case, I also did some baking. And then I started to gain weight and I said I better stop baking. And I read. And of course, most evenings we're watching Netflix or some home movie. I did quite a lot of the drawing and the art. I started pastels. I find it very restful, the art. I'm focused and I'm just doing this thing that is very focused and pleasurable. And I made a concerted effort to really learn more about publishing because, as Dr. Magan mentioned, I have this business called Filipino American Literary House, PALH, and I thought, well, and usually I would hire somebody to do the cover, I would hire somebody to do the production work. And I thought maybe I should learn more of that so that I can do more, I can cut back on costs. And so that's what I was spending a lot of time on, learning a lot more about publishing. The writing, I have a nonfiction piece in my head, but I call it composting. It's in there, but it's not gelled. So I'm just thinking about it and I'm just sort of leaving it alone. Now and then I make little stabs at it, but nothing really has developed yet. So the publishing, the art, and I have an editing project. So I won't talk about it. Writers are superstitious and they always say, don't talk about what you're writing about or your projects because it may die. And so I won't mention it, but hopefully it will develop. And so something I'm editing. So if we could look at the next set of slides, I wanted to give you the notion that it is important for us to also have an international view of the world and not just think of Cebu. And so, these are just, I met Salman Rushdie in the PAN conference in Barcelona, and people should know who Salman Rushdie is. He's the one who wrote Satanic Verses, Midnight's Dream. I guess what I am saying is that we, as readers, should expose ourselves also to find international works, not just Cebuano works, although that's important, and we'll get to that. And so we'll look at the next slide. So I was involved with, this is the group of women, Filipino American women writers and artists, PAWA. And so we had founded this group. And so we actually published some children's books and worked together and just had great fun together. These are writers. The third woman over, Valerie Bejarano, is actually of Cebu roots. I forget her mom's name, but her mother was Cebuana, and Valerie used to visit Cebu all the time. Unfortunately, Valerie passed away quite a while ago. Anyway, so this is PAWA, Filipino American Women Writers and Artists, and we can look at the next slide. So the next slide shows another group of women. So this is the Pacific Asian American women writers and artists, I believe. And this was a group in California. And so these are, actually some of these people were into theater. Momoko Iko's way down there. And if you're into theater, you would know some of them. And top right is Naomi Hirahara, who is a bestseller, Japanese-American bestseller of crime books. And so I was working with these women. And again, it was the same sort of thing where we organize literary events and kind of allow the women's voices, Pacific Asian women's voices, heard in California. And we were quite successful doing that. So that's the PAL. And I believe we have one more slide. And the next slide is just to bring us back to Cebu. And so here to my far right is Ian Kasokot. He's in Dumaguete. And there I am. And this was taken at one of the Cebu Lit Fests organized by Henry Go on the other side. And on the far left is a Singaporean travel writer. I should mention, in case anybody is interested, that Henry Go actually has a theater workshops next week for kids and teens. And if you are interested, you should look up Little Boy Prods, Little Boy Productions. Apparently, the teachers like Pinky Amador and Red Atadero played the lead in Eraser Musical are involved in this. So let me address the question that Dr. Listen gave me. What advice can you offer our English majors in terms of reading our very own writers and writing for the future generation? So I believe it is important, if you are an English major, you need to know your material. You read the classics. I mean, you'll have to read the classics. You'll have to do Shakespeare and all of this. And I think and like I mentioned, you need to read fine writings from other countries too. And don't forget, read Philippine literature, and not just Philippine literature, but also our Philippine folklore, our Philippine epics. We actually have Philippine epics. They are very important. When I was in my first book, my first novel, When the Rainbow Goddess Wept, actually includes some of this, my retellings of our ancient Philippine epics. To those who don't know, the students perhaps, thousands of years, a long time ago, the Philippines, but even now, I believe we still have them. We had Filipino epics in remote areas who sang epic songs. They actually had very lengthy epic songs. And there were different epic songs from different regions. And we had our own academics, folklorists, and anthropologists who transliterated them. And so they are available now and transliterated and translated into English. And so you can actually get a hold of them and read them. Sometimes they're not easy to read, but if you work at it, you can get to the story. It's remarkable. When I read this Philippine epics, I was in an epic group that used to meet at UCLA. It gave me such a sense of identity and pride at being Filipino. Again, you remember I mentioned to you the Western point of view. When I was in college, we didn't study Philippine epics, we were studying Homer. And imagine my surprise and my pride when I learned that we have our own river of the dead and that we have our own goddess who watched this river so that if she took care of the dead babies. So that was her job. When the dead babies were ready to go into the next world, the afterworld, she was there by the river. It was something like the river Styx. And what she did was she would nurse them. And so the image of this goddess Maybuyan is one with multiple breasts all over her body. And imagine, to my surprise, when I was in Europe and in some museum when I saw a goddess figure with multiple breasts. And I just went, that is the goddess Meguya. So, it kind of connects you with the world. It makes you, it made me proud in any case. And I realized we have an ancient culture, and it was a culture that had literature, oral in any case. And so this is why I also encourage looking at folklore and our own Philippine epics. When you are, and so this is to both English majors who are read, or in terms of reading, are very on writers and writing for the future generation. When you are reading our stories, don't get too hung up over the language, but focus on the depth of the characters. I mentioned this to you. Are they complex characters? Do they ring true? I really liked the talk by the person in place of the president when there was some reference about deep reading, deep literature versus something shallow. That is how you develop serious stories, by having complex characters. When your characters are shallow, you will get a shallow story. It's not, you can put it together, but it's not going to be really strong or memorable. Our stories reflect and validate our own reality. These stories document our lives, our conflicts, our history, our culture. Knowing these stories is important to us as well as to the future generation. I don't know whose quote this is, but I really like it. You have to know where you came from in order to know where you are going. You have to know where you came from in order to know where you are going. That's very important in life, not just as writers or readers, but as human beings. We have to know our history or our stories, which you can glean from fiction, and to learn from them. Because, history repeats itself. That it sounds like a cliche, but it's actually quite true. It is the same for writers. Writers, we have to write our own stories in our own voices. Because, if we don't write our stories, who will? Sometimes I come across some writers who, Filipinos perhaps, or here in the States, other so-called ethnic writers, and their main protagonists, are white characters, like Anglo-white characters. And some of them are quite successful. We have a Filipina writer, and she's there in Manila, I believe she still is. And she wrote the book, and her protagonist has green eyes and blonde hair and so on and so forth. And it's a commercial story. And in that sense, it was successful in that sense. But I'm thinking to myself, do we really need another story of a blonde, blue-eyed character? I don't think so. I think there are many of those already. And at least for me, I feel that my job is not to add to that body of literature, but to try to add to our body of literature, to try and reflect our own reality. That is what I try to do. And it's not that I'm saying that everybody should do that, because it's not right or wrong. It's just choices that we make. And that if you are writers, you will have to make that choice perhaps one day. Here's another choice that I had to make when I was a beginning writer. I thought, if I could write those murder mysteries romance. I said, I could be a romance writer, and I can write about, and I could do it every year, and I could be rich and famous or some such thing. So I said, okay, I'll do this. So then I started writing, and you can find formula for this. So it's the first 10 pages, boy meets girl. And then in the next, so many pages, boy is separated from girl. And then, and so on and so forth. So I started to write, and, it was work. And I thought, really, it was a lot of work, even though it was formula. And so I'm thinking, I asked myself, is this really what I want to do? Do I really want to labor over this? And the answer was no. If I was going to work hard over something, then it should be something that is meaningful to me. And so that is really how I kind of ended up doing what I'm doing. So there are choices that will come along your way, and you'll have to think them through. And in the end, that is your decision. I'm only sharing what I have done and what I have seen others do. Writers, to those of you who are writers, should take classes to learn the craft. Sometimes in my teaching, I was teaching the writers program at UCLA, and these were adults. And they would come and they knew everything, students, but they knew plot, they knew everything. And it was really hard to teach those who knew everything. It was so much easier to teach somebody who, with acceptance and humility, says, you know what, I need help. Help me here. So you take classes to learn the craft. It will make your work better. It did for me. Writers should read the best writings, especially the type of writing that they want to do. If you want to be a poet, read the best poetry. If you want to be a novelist, read the best novels that are available. Here's another thing. If you write, keep a journal. Just any notebook, the cheapest notebook you can get. I remembered when I started writing, I would get these really expensive journals, and then I would get blocked because the paper was too pretty. It was too expensive. So I used to just get notebook, and I would write. I kept a journal, and I still do. Journal is very nice, a diary, because it's non-judgmental. You just write every day, perhaps. And you just feel free. But hopefully, people who live with you will respect it, and it's like exercise. You write it, and also, diaries are very important. In historically, you will find that diaries, journals have a place. I believe there is one about the pandemic in England that's now surfacing. Daniel Defoe's the Black Plague or something like that. Now, I believe this was not real, but he used that form of a diary. The other thing that writers need to do is you should learn to let your work rest before rewriting. To work in. When you finish a work and then you just start rewriting right away, you don't really have objectivity. So you let it rest for a week or a few days, and then when you pick it up, you will be able to see it with fresh eyes, which is really what you want to do. Otherwise, if you're in a workshop, that helps, because then your workshoppers are your fresh eyes. You need to learn how to accept critiquing. Sometimes it's very painful, because when we finish something, we think it's perfect. And when people come along and start pointing out things that didn't work, it's painful. But here's the deal. It's very rare an occasion when you write something and it comes out perfect. I think I only had, out of almost 60 short stories, maybe I had one. I think it was Butterscotch Marble that pretty much came out intact. Most of the time, you write and then you right? And you fix it. So that's the truth of it. In terms of critiquing, it also works both ways, because if you're in a workshop, you're going to be critiquing other people's works. And of course, I'm sure your teachers will guide you, but one should be sensitive and careful in terms of giving feedback. Sometimes it's posed as a question rather than, well, this dialogue is not good. You can just say, why did the mother say such and such? And that can get across the point that you want to say. Then here's another thing I discovered about critiquing. Sometimes your workshoppers, your companions, will complain about this or that in your story. But it isn't exactly what they're saying. And so what I've learned is that they're just sensing that something's amiss. And then I have learned that I just need to look at it and see what they're trying to express. Another thing, you don't have to do everything that they tell you. In the end, you are the writer and you have to make decisions. These are just aids. It's like looking in a mirror, in a sense. And then if you go, well, so what? I really like red lipstick. If they're telling you something, but you have an idea of how the work stands. So, for instance, if they're telling you, the dialogue is confusing, you weigh it, and maybe you're getting something else by having this confusing dialogue, and you go, well, no, I don't really mind if it's confusing. It's important for me to just leave it like that. You're the author. And also, do not be discouraged, because writers evolve and get better. And so this is the galleys of the U.S. edition of the newspaper Widow. And I have to tell you a little bit, because how this came about, and I mentioned to you about work evolving. This was supposed to be a murder mystery. When I finished the second novel, Magdalena, I thought, it might be fun to write a murder mystery. And so I started. But I wanted it set in 1909. And I used my great-grandmother as my model for the protagonist. My great-grandmother was Remedios Cuenco. And by default, because her husband passed away, she became a newspaper person. She ran the Imprenta Rosario and published newspapers. So this was back in 1909. So the overall story that I came up with is that the widow, Ines Maceda, with the help of her French friend, there's a French woman in Quebec, set out to solve the mystery of a dead priest. There's a priest that's found in the creek. So the excerpt that I'm going to share with you is really near the end of the book. So this whole mystery thing has already transpired and we're near the end. But I'm sharing it with you because it's really talking about the notion of character change and character development, an important part of Ines Maceda's life. So there is a ball, a carnival ball, and so Ines is with her friend, the seamstress, and they're looking at clothes for women who will be wearing them to this grand ball, this carnival. So Ines, who is a widow, her husband had died, is thinking. The sight of the extravagant gowns gave Ines a sinking sadness. She felt left out, as if she were not part of this sorority of women, these lucky owners of haute couture designed by Melisande, this is a French friend, whose name had become a legend in the world of women. Anything with Melisandre's brand. Brand. I'm going to switch eyeglasses. Better. The sight of the extravagant gowns gave Inez a sinking sadness. She felt left out, as if she were not part of the sorority of women, these lucky owners of haute couture designed by Melisande, whose name had become a legend in the world of women. Anything with Melisandre's brand conjured a sense of the Parisian, implying a blend of culture, art, sensuality, and beauty. Inez sighed, knowing her plain black gown would set her aside from the rest of the women who would show off their Melisande gowns. These women would flaunt their heirloom jewelry as well, so they would glitter, perhaps more than the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Hall. Melisande returned with more gowns in her arms, which she set on the table. This is mine, she said, spreading out an apricot silk chiffon evening dress with crossover front bodice and tiered skirt. And this one is your mother's. This was blue silk satin chiffon trimmed with black passementerie with gold metallic and ecru lace. Did Maman see when she'll be in Ubec? Melisande asked. She's arriving tonight, Inez replied. Remind her to come in to fit her gown, Melisande said, as she reached for another gown. This one was made in the traditional Filipino style with a top with full sleeves and a long skirt. The blouse was made of ecru pineapple fiber with intricate black embroidery, the skirt of silk with black and off-white stripes. This is yours, Inez, Melisande said. Try it on. Inez placed her hand over her heart. She had not ordered a dress. She had been so caught up with events and had no time to think of such triviality. Besides, she was still mourning. But, Inez started, but when she was quickly interrupted by Melisande. No buts, Melisande said. Your son will be on stage. You must look exquisite. I can't, Melisande. It's not completely black. It has not been a year. Our custom dictates. Whew, uncustom, Melisande said, as she scrunched her nose and flicked her right hand dismissively. This is almost black, Inez. She held up the dress and shook it so that it shimmered. Both women looked at the gown, which now seemed to have picked up a luminescent quality. The black embroidery contrasted handsomely against a lighter background. The silk skirt had an indescribable, unearthly shimmer. It's a beautiful gown, Inez, Melisande continued. You must wear it. It's my gift to you. And because Inez remained silent, Melisande prodded, Andres will like it. Everyone will be dressed to the hilt. You've seen what the women will be wearing. Oh, fabulous. You, the mother of the prince consort, must not be outshined. Try it on and make sure it fits. Melisande gave her a little push into the dressing room. The room was nothing more than a small cubicle with a three-way mirror. And standing in that confined space, Inez weighed the rightness and wrongness of not dressing completely in black while in mourning versus the desire to look nice on the night her son would be one of Ubec's luminaries, a night when everyone would be dressed in their finest, and how painful it suddenly felt to consider being clothed in something nondescript on such a special night. In the end, she removed her widow's dress and slipped on the black and white gown. As she smoothed the skirt down, she remembered the diamond set that Pablo had bought her from the Tsar of Siam jewelers, and she knew the jewelry would complement the evening dress. Melisande clapped her hands in the light and Inez presented herself. It fits perfectly, Melisande gushed as she led Inez to a full-length mirror. Melisande fussed with Inez's hair, pulling out a few strands on the sides so curly strands appeared near her cheekbones. Don't pull the bun too tightly, Melisande said. Keep it loose with some curls to soften the face. Ines stared at her image with astonishment, except since Pablo had died and she had been wearing black, her skin had turned sallow, as if the dark color had seeped into her and leached the life out of her. But now, the ecru colored gauzy fabric brightened her face, made her look younger, happier somehow. She fingered a silk skirt which had a softness and sensuality that seemed alien to her. For months, she had felt like a soldier in a battlefield, taking on the world, figuring out finances, worrying over Pablo's business. Then there was a harrowing scare regarding her son, clad in the armor of black, swimming in her widow's sorrows and fears. She had become stiff and unyielding. She barely recognized the woman in the mirror. She did not mean to, but tears formed in her eyes. Embarrassed, she lowered her head so Melisande would not see her face. But the Frenchwoman did, and she rushed to Inez and embraced her, saying, "You're beautiful. Wait and see. Coronation night to be perfect." Tears fell down Inez's cheeks, even as she smiled. And I'll end the excerpt there. That's from the newspaper Widow. If you come across it, uh, you will see a lot of Ubec slash Cebu in there, including very interesting. We had a train in Cebu, and so this includes a train trip to Karkar and a lot of other little details about Cebu that may be interesting to you. I think at this point, and we could probably move on to Q&A if there's time. I leave it up to Dr. Listen as to what you should do.
Yes, madam. We're actually going to have a Q&A.
So while we're waiting, I just really want to thank everybody again, the organizers, especially Dr. Listen, all the professors at the university, and for those who have participated, have taken the time. I am very grateful to all of you for uh, giving me this opportunity to share with you my thoughts.
Daghang salamat sa pagpaambit sa imong kasinatian sa pagsulat, Madam Cecilia Manguerra Brainard. These experiences inspires our young writers nowadays to write about Cebu or Sugbo. Thank you so much, Madam. It is our pleasure to have you here. At this juncture, I know everyone is excited nga ipaambit ang inyong tagsa-tagsa ka mga pangutana. And so, I will not hold you any longer. Ladies and gentlemen, please let us give our virtual round of applause to Professor Aida Vergaon, our chairperson for College of Arts and Sciences Internalization, and Dr. Juan Marie Mangumpit, our University Director for Media Communications, for our Q&A and the open forum.
And we'd also like to thank Madam Cecilia Manguerra Brainard for inspiring us and our students taken notes. I'm personally, I'm very inspired. Okay, so this time we're now going with Justin Baricar. Ma'am Cecilia. Okay,
Yes.
so okay, how would you define a Filipino woman of today from your portrayal of Filipino woman 30 years ago? A very interesting question.
Huh. So okay. So what's okay? I think I understand the question. I will tell you that right here, especially in California, when I started writing and publishing a few works, there were not a lot of Filipino writers. And so it was, so we had NBM Gonzalez, and we had Ben Santos, and we had PC Morante, and we had Ligaya Fruto over in Hawaii, and there were a handful of Filipino American slash writers. And so I found myself trying to be part of this group in a way. And so this is in marked contrast to now, because now, especially in the States, there are far more Filipino American writers uh, writing. And so they're not quite as alone as as I may have felt during my time. It was very difficult to publish at that time because we were different. Our stories were different. And if you will look at these writers that I mentioned, most of their books were published in the Philippines. I believe NBM had a collection published by the University of Washington Press, but otherwise, most of them were published in the Philippines. So what does that mean? That means that American publishers were not open to um, to our works. It was very difficult. So um, you kind of had to be tough, uh, extra tough and hard-headed 30 years ago. Uh, I'm not saying that it's easy now either for the younger writers, but I'm thinking that the doors have been open. The doors have been open in terms of getting their works published. The part of our problem, and I'm just going to track off a little bit, is that Filipino Americans were not really buying books. And so, this is a business. So publishers then want to make money. And if the books are not selling, they're not really very excited about publishing someone. And so this was very difficult in the beginning. Now we have Jessica Hagedorn. We have Ninoch Karoska, who published big time, so to speak. But you could count them at your fingers at that time. And now we have more writers: Randy Ribay, Erin Estrada, Entrada, and many more publishing works. So that's one difference that I can see between the then and the now, or a couple of differences. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Here's also another question which is related to the current time. Okay, from Ricky Flores. So when talking about literature in modern youth or modern society right now, what would be the best medium to keep the audience engaged and hooked? By Ricky Flores.
I wonder if you could backtrack a little bit and just quick read it to me.
Okay, so I'm going to read this again. When talking about literature in modern youth or modern society right now, what would be the best medium to keep the audience engaged and hooked?
My cat just jumped up on me. That's why I got sidetracked. What is the best medium? And obviously we have social media, and we now have online sites, and so in a way this is really good for writers because you can probably find venues for your poetry and for your stories online, and we did not have that before. um, I don't know really if there's one one answer to that. I mean, people will always look for books, and even if it's in books in e-form, it is still a book. Um, so it's something like, yeah. So it's just it has kind of expanded our opportunities nowadays. You have the hard copy book, you have ebooks, you have things online now. So I don't think there's just one answer to that question.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I understand that there are already many opportunities in social media, or even submitting short stories or poems can be done in the website or in online literary journals. Okay, thank you,
Thank
very
you.
much. And then there are still more questions. Okay, Joanne Plant Mungado is very interested. Okay, perhaps this is my assumption. And then she asked, when can one call him or herself a writer?
Okay. That's a good question. So I had asked myself that when I was learning how to write. And I had a teacher tell me, a writer writes. So because when I was starting, I used to always go, all right, I'm a real writer if I get published. And then I got published and it still wasn't enough. And I go, well, I'm a real writer if I get an award. And then the award comes along and I'm still going, no. So on and on it went. But then she was so calma about it. And she just said, a writer writes. So I think it is that. If you are writing, then you're a writer. And you know what? Emily Dickinson wasn't published, I don't believe, during her lifetime, and yet was a writer. So you're a writer if you write. This is what it is.
Wow. So I become more inspired, Ma'am Cecilia. Okay, so thank you very much. So very simple question, but it's so touching. Okay, so is it necessary to have political elements in fiction by Ivan Grant Orais?
Is it necessary to have political elements? I don't think it's necessary because you're really writing about the internal happenings of a character. So you're talking about emotions and what happens to them. But here's what happens. Your characters are in a setting. And that setting, I mean, unless it's sci-fi, I mean, you can write sci-fi and then there's no politics, or very, you can make up the politics of that fictional world. Because what happens is that your characters are moving and operating within that world that you have created. So in my Ubec, with its own history, my characters were moving and responding to the events of that world that I created. So sometimes there would be political issues in my stories, but sometimes there were none. But they were set in a particular time with all these things happening around them. So, for instance, the newspaper Widow is not a political book, but it's happening during a time when politics was going on, because it tries to be a real world with governments, the Americans in Cebu, the Spanish getting out, and Americans coming in. So that's what it is. So the answer is no, it does not have to be political, but sometimes it can be, depending on the forces acting on your characters. I hope that answers.
Thank you, ma'am. And then Lenny Rose Lisondra also asked this question: what is your biggest downfall as a writer or as an author, and how did you overcome it?
What is my biggest downfall as a writer? I don't know if it's really a big downfall, but when I was younger, I always felt it was important to join so many things, so that I was sort of spread thin. Um, I was in this and that board. I was in this and that group. I was in, I mean, I don't know. I think it was one of those things where I had to prove myself, I was a real writer, or I was an important or serious writer, and so on. And when I look back at it, a lot of it just sapped my energy unnecessarily. So that probably if I were to do it again, I would be more discerning. I would be more careful about where I put my time and energy instead of just saying yes to everything. Somebody come along and say, would you do it? Yes. Would you? Yes. Now I would probably think more carefully and see if it fits my life and my work. So so it's not such a big downfall, but it's something that now and then I think about.
Okay. And then Regine Ann Kadugdug also asked what to do to keep yourself as a writer, continue writing.
Okay. This is a good question because I am really quite undisciplined. I know many writers are very disciplined, and you should if you can be. So what do disciplined writers do? They set aside a particular chunk of time and they work, say, from 9 until noon. Or I think actually Hemingway did that. He would work first thing in the morning and work till noon, and then in the afternoon he was free. Um, so that is what the disciplined writers do because I am not like that. And the reason I'm like that is I have always had family around me. I always had children, and, so on and so forth. And they always demanded my time. So it was not always easy for me to just set aside that time. What I have done is I take master workshops. So I haven't been able to because of the pandemic, but otherwise I will do that. There is a woman I know who conducts a master workshop, because what happens is that if somebody tells me that I have to submit 10 pages next week, I will do that. Otherwise, there's just too many things to do that would prevent me from just, if I were on my own, that would prevent me from actually accomplishing that much. So you can do it either way, you can, but pretty much you have to know yourself, and you have to set some kind of, if you're writing a novel, for instance, you can't just suddenly write it, in 1 month. It's a commitment. And so you have to kind of have some kind of plan or schedule that will make the pages happen. I hope that answers.
Okay, thank you, Ma'am. I apologize. It's really raining here in my location. So can you still hear my voice? Okay, there are still 3 more questions left.
Yes, I can hear you very clearly.
Is it okay? Okay.
Yes.
What advice can you give to the young aspiring writers? This is asked by Frances Florence Duran.
Oh, what advice? So I gave some of that already. And so, to sum it up, you need to learn the craft, number one. But even more important than the craft, you need to read a lot. You need to read and read and read and read the kind of work that you would like to accomplish. And then there are the other things that I mentioned, not to be discouraged, to maybe keep a journal so that you can practice, to be in a workshop. But reading is very, very important. Reading and exercise.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Peter Paul Arnado from Tuburan Campus. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. Is Peter Paul around?
So we have one.
Hello, Peter. Are you there? Peter
Yes,
Paul?
hello, good
Okay,
morning.
you can ask your
Good
question
morning,
now.
Peter.
Good morning, Mom Brainard. Actually, our study is entitled, our study is one of your story, which is entitled Woman with Horn. And our research study is entitled The Historical Moments on Cecilia Manguerra Brainard's short story, Woman with Horn. So my question is about the story Woman with Horn. So this is our question, ma'am. So, what are your greatest inspirations in writing the story Woman with Horns and the challenges that you encountered in achieving this kind of literary work?
You know, I'll tell you the inspiration of that character. When I was a little girl there in Cebu, there was a woman who was said to have sungay, nakulo siya sungay. And so we would see her, and she always had kind of like a poof hairdo, you know.
Ah,
And
yes.
um, so she sat in my imagination because every time we saw her, we would go, Nay, Nana siya sungay day. And so I said, oh, you know, so that's possible to have horns. And so that's where she came from, the character. But she came out different, of course, you know, in the Agustina, our woman with horns. And she is a widow. But unlike Inez, Agustina is a younger and somewhat more sensual widow, if you will. So I'm not, yes, some of these creations that we make as writers are not entirely logical. They come to you in little bits and pieces. And basically, for me, it will come in images. So I can see her very clearly in my imagination. And I can see Dr. McAllister clearly in my imagination. And I can see the world clearly in my imagination. But sometimes, before it becomes clear, the images are incomplete. And so it's it's a matter of making the image grow in a sense. Sometimes I'm reading historical things, and I go, oh, okay, well then you know she would be wearing this, or she would be saying this, or she would be cooking this, and so on. So it's little bits and pieces that just sort of come to me, and I kind of splice them together, if you will, into the story. Um, so could you repeat the second part of your question?
Um, what are the challenges that you encountered in achieving this kind of literary work?
Well, there wasn't much of a challenge except writing the story. Um, you know, I mean, it wasn't controversial. It wasn't. It was just making the story work. So that was the effort was a creative one, more than more than external stuff. And it was just really knowing the characters. And the main character is Gerald McAllister, actually. He's the protagonist.
Yes.
And then he happens to meet Agustina, the woman with horns, and they fall in love. Uh, so that was it. You just have to focus on making your characters complex, as I had mentioned. You make them as real as you can. And how do you do that? And those of you who are using my fundamentals of creative writing, there is a part in there that's talking about fleshing out a character. And fleshing out a character helps you make them real, makes them feel real. It's like you know them as well as you know your best friend, you know, in your head. And then you have to find out their point of conflict. So, because if you have a character and there's no conflict, it's the most boring thing. There's not You're not going to have a story. So there must be a kind of a problem, so to speak. And we know Gerald McAllister's problem. I mean, he was this sort of hardened, widower who's sort of, a little bit bitter and this kind of thing. And it's Agustina who counters, who softens him. They're sort of like opposites. Um, so, uh, and really, in terms of once the story was written, it was it was easy to get it. I submitted it and it was published. And that story has been published and anthologized several times. It's a very popular story.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. The last but not the least, here's a question from Christine uh, Diaz. Let me read her question. Some writers want to explore writing and including taboo topics in their literary work, mainly to open the eyes of the audience and educate them about these topics or issues. But these writers are hesitant because of the backlash they might get. So, her question is, what advice can you give? And then, do you think it's okay for writers to venture in writing taboo topics? Why and why not? By Christine Jean Diaz, the BAL 3A student.
Okay. Yes, those are important questions, and it's it's difficult for writers. In a way, being far away, writing from California about Quebec, as I mentioned, makes it easier for me because I don't have to explain to people that no, this isn't really about my mother. It's already fiction. No, that's not really my boyfriend. That's already fiction. If I were there, that would probably get into my way also when you're trying to create a character and people come along and go, you're writing about, whoever it is kind of thing. So yes, I recognize there's um, that kind of difficulty. And also in terms of like taboo topics. Um, Here's the thing. I mean, this is why, okay, we call it fiction because we assume it's not true. So I offer this to you as a way to help you be free. It's fiction. So if you want to write about whatever it is and it's fictionalized, people shouldn't really give you too much hassle. And if they do, you just tell them that's fiction. In terms of taboo topics that are taboo, um, it is really how well done you write a story that will eliminate that issue. I mean, if you look at Lolita, um, is that Nabokov, the Russian Nabokov? Lolita. Well, it's a little bit touchy that it's a taboo kind of topic, but it's literature. So there are other topics that are kind of touchy, but then if it is well crafted and the characters are authentic, then then it should work. If you're just writing taboo topics just to be sensational, I would advise against it. Um, it's a kind of a cheap way of getting attention. And that's not the point. The point is to write about believable characters, complex characters, and and their journey, their emotional journey, whether it's something really horrible or something very simple, as long as there is character development and character change, you should have a story. So the goal is not, don't worry too much about the taboo aspect of it, but focus your energy on creating authentic characters, complex characters with real conflicts in a world that is believable. So I hope that helps.
So that's all for the open forum. Thank you very much,
Thank
Cecilia,
you.
for sharing with us your journey in writing. We are very proud of you as a Filipino writer. Okay, so here in the Philippines and in Cebu and in City.
Thank you so very much. And thank you again to Dr. Christian Listen for inviting me, and to everyone for your kind introductions and kind words, and for your attention. And for the students who asked questions, thank you. I appreciate it. And God bless you all.
Mic test. Mic test. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Mangumbit, for facilitating the Q&A portion of the forum. And now, thank you everyone for your participation and insightful questions.